Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to another book review from me, your humble host, Logan Albright. Today, we're going to talk some philosophy. I've been interested in reading more philosophy lately. It's something that I've, read a little bit of, but not too much, and I'd like to get more into it and read some more of the classics. And I was watching a YouTube video about Arthur Schopenhauer and a number of other philosophers, and I thought he sounded interesting. So I swung by my local Barnes & Noble, and I picked up this book called On the Suffering of the World by Arthur Schopenhauer, edited by Eugene Thacker. It is a collection of some of his later writings from some of his major works. So it's a little bit of an anthology. It's not like anything complete, and that sort of bothers me. I like to read, a little bit of a completist. I like to read the actual works that people wrote instead of just selections from them. I don't like greatest hits collections, so to speak, but this is what they had, and it was a nice, manageable, bite-sized piece of Schopenhauer's philosophy, because his other works, his complete works, are quite long and daunting to get through. So it's kind of nice to have something a little shorter to start out with. Although I may eventually go back and read the complete works, because I quite like Schopenhauer. I find him very interesting as a writer and as a philosopher. He was German. He lived from 1788 to 1860, I believe. And the first thing to know about Schopenhauer is that he was quite miserable and gloomy and grumpy. It comes through very clearly in his philosophy, where he basically argues that the central feature of life on earth is suffering, and that happiness is merely the absence of suffering. Happiness is not an active force for good in the world. It's just the relief you feel when the constant suffering momentarily pauses. He argues that, the pain we feel is much more pronounced and much more memorable than any pleasure we feel. Any kind of temporary joy we get in life is far outweighed by the suffering and the misery that we experience, and it would be better not to have been alive at all, is basically his argument. So quite gloomy stuff, quite pessimistic, and in fact, he was a pessimist in the philosophical sense of the word. People now use the term optimist and pessimist pretty casually to mean an optimist is someone who expects good things to happen, and a pessimist is someone who expects bad things to happen. Originally, the optimist school of philosophy basically held that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and this was a view that was mocked by Voltaire in Candide, which I've read a long time ago and thought that was interesting. And Schopenhauer similarly dismisses the view that we live in the best of all possible worlds as ridiculous, and he takes the opposite view, which is that we live in the worst of all possible worlds. And that may sound very hyperbolic and crazy, because obviously we can imagine things being worse than they are, but he kind of uses the fine-tuning argument, which is an argument that is used to justify or support the belief in the existence of God, to make his point. And so the fine-tuning argument basically has that if you look at the parameters of the universe, things are like perfectly balanced on a knife edge to allow us to exist. If the Earth was a little closer to the sun, we'd all die. If the Earth was a little further away from the sun, we'd all die. If gravity was a little stronger, we'd all die. If gravity was a little weaker, we'd all die. Everything is just perfectly balanced, and people use this as an argument to say that there must have been a designer for this. Schopenhauer is not a theist. I believe he's an atheist, and he kind of takes a different look at this argument, and he argues that if we tried to make anything worse than it is, if we tried to make it a little hotter or a little colder or the gravity a little weaker or a little stronger, the whole thing would fall apart, and the universe couldn't exist and life couldn't exist. And therefore, if you try to make anything worse, nothing could happen. We live in the worst of all possible worlds that could exist. If you made it worse, the world couldn't exist as it is. So therefore, the world we live in is as bad as it can possibly get, unless you were to change everything about the universe, I guess. So that's his argument. I don't really agree with it, but it's an interesting argument. And so it's, pretty miserable guy. He seemed to like dogs, which is nice, but he seemed to have much contempt for humans and believe that, there's not much good going on. Life is mainly a disappointment for him. But that's not the extent of his philosophy. He has a lot of other interesting things to say. One of the most valuable contributions he brought to philosophy is his reading of Buddhist and Hindu texts and kind of incorporating them into Western philosophy a little bit, and taking a much more Eastern approach to his understanding of the nature of reality and of the universe and of the afterlife and things like that. So, for example, Buddhism holds that the nature of life is suffering, and that the cause of suffering is attachment. When we become emotionally attached to things, we become upset when we lose those things, or we contemplate the possibility of losing those things. And so the way to escape suffering is to break attachment and to kind of dissolve the ego, the consciousness of self and your idea of yourself as an individual, to break all that down and to not be attached to anything, and to have this kind of ascetic existence where it's like you don't care about anything. And if you don't care about anything, then you can't suffer, because you can't be brought misery by the idea that something you love is going to go away because you don't love anything. That's sort of the Buddhist idea. I'm simplifying it, but that's basically what it is. And Schopenhauer takes a similar view. He looks at like religious practices both in the East and in the West, in like monasteries and ascetic monks in Christianity and things like that, people who fast and people who wear hair shirts and flog themselves and stuff, and says that this is a good way to escape the constant suffering. And he has this idea of the will as being distinct from the intellect or the personality. The will is a part of the body that basically, or the part of the self that basically tries to, wants to be alive and wants to continue in the world and wants things to be good. And he says you have to detach from the will, you have to break the will, annihilate the will to live, and that's how you can end suffering, and you can be happy, happy being the absence of suffering, by not being attached to life, not having the will constantly telling you have to survive and you have to live. So he has this whole concept of will, and he also has this concept that the will is something that survives after death. He doesn't believe that the personality or the intellect survives after death in the way that a lot of religions do, but he has more of a Hindu idea that there's some part of the person that kind of just merges back in the universe after death, and he calls that the will. It's basically come from the idea that like matter can't be destroyed or created. It just can change shape. So he says we shouldn't fear death because we're going to merge back into the universe when we die, and it's going to be an end to suffering, and it's not a bad thing. So that's basically, in this book, the part of his philosophy that they cover. He also has a very good essay at the end of the book on suicide. And yes, I'm going to talk about suicide on YouTube because I don't get paid for these videos anyway, so I don't care if I get demonetized or the algorithm punishes me. I'm not going to use ridiculous euphemisms like a lot of people do. I think that suicide is a very interesting topic, and I've read a couple books on it. And he has a very good essay on it in here, in which he argues that we should not view it as some kind of a crime or a moral outrage, but we should view it with sympathy, and that suicide is sort of the rational response to someone who finds the terror of life exceeding the terror of death. I think that's the phrase he uses, the terror of life and the terror of death. And he argues that if we own anything, we own our own bodies and we own our own lives, and we have the right to do what we choose with them, including ending them, and that it should not be viewed with the kind of prohibitionist eye to saying that this is a crime of some sort that should be punished. And he points to the ridiculousness of trying to punish someone who is seeking death, because what can you punish them with? They already want to die. They already think life is miserable. How can you punish them for that? So that's a very good essay. He's got other essays which are not included in this volume. Very infamously, he has an essay on women, which is extremely, I haven't read it, so I don't know what it says, but from all accounts, it's extremely misogynistic and unpleasant. So not an altogether great guy, I suppose, but that's not included in this volume. And I'm interested in reading other works of his more major works, because it sounds like there's a lot of interesting essays that are not included in this volume. And I'm a little bit annoyed that I will have to double up in my collection of the works that are included here. And then if I buy the full works, I'm going to have them twice. I guess I can always sell this book or give it away. But, I don't like to have double the amount of the same text more than once in my library. I like to have it a little more organized than that. So that's a little bit annoying. I also think, there's something oddly comforting about someone who's as pessimistic and as miserable as Schopenhauer is. I don't know, maybe it's just me and I'm weird, but I find him kind of funny, and I find him kind of just how extreme and how miserable he is, and I find it a little bit comforting to read, because you realize that however hard things get for you, you're not going to be as unhappy as Schopenhauer was. So I don't know, there's something nice about reading that kind of thing, at least as far as I'm concerned. I didn't find it depressing. A lot of people regard this as very depressing. I found it a little bit like paradoxically uplifting, just to hear this point of view about things, even though I don't always agree with him. It's interesting. So I enjoyed Schopenhauer a lot. It's not very difficult reading. A lot of philosophy I've tried to read, like for example, I've been trying to read the Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant for like 4 years. I can't get through it because it's impossible to read. This is much easier to read than that sort of thing. So if you are interested in delving into philosophy, this isn't too hard to get through, and I think you can understand it without too much difficulty. The translation is good. Apparently in the original, Schopenhauer uses a lot of foreign words and phrases and passages from French and Latin and Greek and German. Well, he wrote naturally in German, but all these languages are intermingled, so it's hard to translate, but I think the translator does a good job here. I think the selection is pretty good. The editor, Eugene Thacker, includes an introduction, which is very long. It's like 60-page introduction. And I found that helpful in learning about Schopenhauer's life and learning about kind of more, generally summarizing what his philosophical outlook was before I got into the actual texts themselves. So the book is actually a lot shorter than it appears because it's about 300 pages, but the first 60 pages are the introduction, which you can skip if you want, but I found it useful to learn about Schopenhauer's life. There's an incident early in his life when he saw some slaves or some prisoners being kind of forced to labor, and he was very affected by the view of the prisoners being forced to labor, and I think it impacted his whole view of life and suffering, and that's an interesting kind of backstory note to see where he's coming from as a young man or as a child having that experience. So that's what I have to say about this little book by Arthur Schopenhauer. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to read more of his philosophy. If you read more of his philosophy, please do point me in the right direction of where I should go next. And if you haven't, let me know what you think of this review in the comments. And if you enjoyed the review, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click that bell for notifications, and come back every week for yet another book review, because I'm trying to keep the channel well stocked with new book reviews every single Wednesday, so we have stuff to talk about. Thanks so much for watching. I've been your host, Logan Albright, and I will catch you next time.